Well, here we are, Renee, podcasting in 2026.
I know. And wild enough, I'm the one on the road and not you. This is totally backwards today. We're doing it backwards. You're home and I'm not. So this is a wild conversation. But before we dive into the what we're going to talk about today, what are you doing in the farm in January? It's cold, snow. What else is happening in your world?
Well, this fall, my hydraulic cylinder on my loader, the gaskets blew out, so spraying
Oh,
oil everywhere. I think I complained about this, and so I had to take the hydraulic cylinder into a specialty hydraulic cylinder rebuild shop, which I found one on the corner
didn't
of
know there was
University and
one.
Highway 65, where they all they do is rebuild hydraulic cylinders. So I
Oh,
gotta get that put back together so I can move snow.
to move snow.
Right.
Okay.
Because my tractor's just been sitting immobilized because it's all hardwired, hard.
Oh,
So you can't move
interesting.
it without hydraulic oil spraying everywhere. Yeah.
Wow. That's pretty cool. I didn't know anybody specialized in that.
Well,
So
now you do. So if you need a hydraulic cylinder
if
rebuilt,
I
maybe
do,
they could be a
yes,
sponsor because I'm a big advocate of this hydraulic cylinder company now.
absolutely.
So
The next time I need one, I'll
right,
write it down. That'll be
right.
the place to go. I like it. So today, everybody, we have a really interesting one-off kind of conversation for you. So I was invited down to Houston for what's called a bridge event. It's with a foundation called Arnold Ventures, and they are worked at the intersection of problems, trying to find solutions that have an economic impact on the world. And so they go after tough problems. And parole and probation landed in their tough problem category the last year or so. And they've got a couple people that are championing that. And they work with people like at the Justice Center with CSG, which is the Council of State Governments. They work with other policy institutes. FAM.org is there. That group used to be about the groups for families against mandatory minimums, but now they really work on like reducing prison sentences and all of this. So there's all these people that get brought together to kind of come up with research, causal research. They want to find things that the X proves this, and so that they can make an impact in the world for things that from an economic perspective. So you have economists in the room and stuff. Well, let me just tell you, I've never done anything quite like I just did for the past 2 days. So I get called in as a subject matter expert for being a chair of a board of parole, which makes sense. But I'm at this conference with four other states that are not like Iowa. We're talking California, which California parole is partly determinate, and the only people they see parole for are the lifers that now have an opportunity for parole. So they're talking the murderers, the rapists, the kidnappers, the very high level folks. That's what their Board of Parole does. With Washington State. Washington State only sees parole for juveniles offenders. They see it for some sex offenders, and then again for some lifers that were long term because they went to a determinate sentencing along the way. So the people that were there prior to the law change have to still have a parole system, and the ones that are past that don't. So they've got this hybrid blend. Texas is just a massive parole system. They have indeterminate sentencing like we do, but they have like regions of parole. So you're thinking like down in Austin, Texas, there's a region. Down here in Houston, where I am, there's a region. So then it kind of builds up like a pyramid. And then there's a director of parole, but that person really is in the Austin area, more like working with legislature. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of staff. I mean, it's just a whole different ball of wax, just like California. And then the last one was Michigan, also the same. So they're really, really big and have a different kind of system. And so I'm the only one that sees like everybody, like everybody. So I get put on a panel, but that's the perspective. So the whole day is the concept is how do you find research that's going to impact small people like us? And in a lot of ways, if you find things that are you can change in policy, we'd have a massive impact. Because technically, according to the law, I could release anybody on parole tomorrow. Now, nobody wants to hear that. That's not politically correct. That's not what people would like me to do. But if they don't have a minimum sentence or a life sentence in Iowa, I can parole them anytime. So that's very intriguing to researchers because they're like, oh my gosh, you don't have rules. I mean, I have rules, but they're like, it's so flexible. So that's how I think we got drug into the conversation. So we started there. And I thought today we could have a conversation about what in the world. And then there's some of your favorite topics along the way, because we have things like evidence-based economies of scale. We have issues related to whether or not behavioral health should even be considered in this conversation at all. And so I just thought we'd all talk about this and kind of get a wild perspective of
Well, Let's go
behavioral
back
health
to the
and parole.
beginning and tell us what bridge is an acronym for, Renee.
Well, so fun fact, it's not.
It,
An actual, they don't have it as an acronym. It's a word that they're bridging people together from these various groups so that they can
their
create research.
website says it's building research ideas and generating evidence.
Oh, well, there you go. I didn't know that. They never taught me that part. So building research and generating evidence, that
Building
sounds right.
research ideas and generating evidence.
That
So,
sounds right. So they had for this organization had 23 of them this year and hosted
yep.
11 of them in Iowa in Houston. So and it's not just on parole's just one topic. So they have their big ideas are things like criminal justice, health. So this is why it's funny to me that there's nobody talking about the intersection of the two because we're doing both of these separately, but together, no. And so I think I'm a little ahead of my time on this conversation because I'm like, wait, you've got a whole silo of people doing this, and you've got a whole silo of people doing this, and why are they in the same company, right? So I'm like, why are we not putting that together? And I don't think I made any progress. That's the bad news of today's conversation. We did not make an intersection that I was hoping for at this conference, which,
So,
okay, we're not there yet.
so tell us what your days looked like,
Oh,
right? Because
goodness.
I think it sounds like a really rich conversation, but how do the researchers take the information you're sharing and try to turn that into something they're going to go research,
Okay.
right? Because it kind of feels like casting a wide net, and they probably have some ideas of what they want to find out anyway, or what they want to go research.
What?
So how does that work?
Yeah. So weird day. So I got brought in the first day. So I've been here 2 days, and day one was a smaller subset of the big conversation. And they wanted us to kind of talk about things that are going well in our states, what are the opportunities in our states and the barriers to kind of set the scene for the second big bridge day. The bridge day is just one day. So we came in as a subject matter expert, which is wild. I'm now a subject matter expert in parole. No,
Awesome.
no. I know. And I'm like the newest to the crew, right? Everybody else has 20 years experience. Like the guy from Michigan has been in corrections for 37 years. The lady that was from California was there for 14 years, but was a victim advocate before that. So I'm like the baby parole person. So, but a subject matter expert enough to come to this wild. So the first day, what you do is you talk about, they bring the researchers to tell you enough about causal research, and then they had all of us talk about parole. And then they kind of set the scene for like, tomorrow, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're going to talk about. So the way the day worked, the research instructors spoke first. So it was a law professor who used to be at the University of Iowa, who now is at University of Berkeley, California, and he lays the land of like, this is what the research is. We're not looking for correlation, we're looking for causation. So I was really back in school again for this first part. And I'm like, ah, so they're talking about like trying to teach you this is what we're looking for in research. The next guy comes up and says, this is what's the research available currently in the space, which is not a lot. Nobody's
Mm-hmm.
really asked a lot of questions. And to be fair, that's because they vary so wildly in how
Right.
parole even works in so many states. I mean, and it's very much driven by your state law. So they're looking for like the throughput lines that like could make a difference, in some cases small, some cases big, that could actually make an economic impact. And this particular foundation is all about economics. So the other people in the room are economic professors, instructors, researchers who understand the economics of things. So you have to turn not only a research question, but into then how would that make an economic impact, which is way above my brain power. It's beyond what I want to talk about. So they set up the day with, this is the research space we're looking at. And then they have me and the others come up and say, here's the problems in parole. Like, they're like,
Mm-hmm.
this is the constructs we're going for. Here's all the problems in parole. And then the rest of the day was really whiteboarding questions that you could turn into research projects. And so it starts out with, after all the board of parole, we all had that talk. Then they're like, okay, everybody in the room now, that's a bigger room day two with all these researchers and all these people. They say, okay, what all questions do you have? And they listed 40 questions on a wall, easy 40 plus, of like what people have questions about parole, which shows that there's just not a lot of data out there. So it turned into a lot of questions about, could you do this to impact this and whatever. And then there was a whole nother section about outcomes, like what could you measure to actually show something changed? So things that people want to measure could be like education and if it makes a difference keeping them out of prison. Everybody
Mhm.
likes to talk about recidivism. There's no
Right.
national definition for that, by the way. So the way states calculate it varies, which makes it a wildly weird outcome. So one of the suggestions from day one was like, look, you're going to have to standardize that definition if you're going to use it in research, because
Right.
then the goalpost moves, depends on who you're talking to.
You,
So
you
there's
know,
not
I'm
like a lot of things. So we're talking like some people count success as we got them onto Medicaid. Well, I'm in a red state. I'm like,
right.
I think if you could work their way off Medicaid, that's a
Mhm.
better messaging for red states that are like,
Right.
we don't want to move them just from prison to all state entitlements because it still costs us a lot
Mhm.
of money. So I'm like, I was like arguing with the guy from the University of California, Berkeley, and he's like, "Well, it's a success if we get them onto healthcare." And I'm like, "Not if the state's still paying for it. I mean, not from a legislator and a governor's perspective.
Right.
How is that successful? Because now we just pay for them over here when we were paying for them over here." I said, "So yes, maybe to get them out, to get them started so that they have their benefits, so that they keep their programming. But if they can get employment to and work their way off entitlements in 3 years, 5 years, whatever, that's the success story that's going to play in states like mine.
You
And
know,
they
I've
could,
this is really an interesting conversation
yeah,
because, we spend so much of our time, at Rural Policy Partners deflecting and diverting people from the criminal justice system. And so it's
right.
interesting to hear the work that's being done on the back end after someone has been involved. But I mean, looking at the data, the total number of people paroled each year across the country is only like 300,000 people, right, Renee? So, I
Yeah.
mean, it's relatively a small amount of people. So I'm just wondering, like, how much dollars are we investing in this back end retrospect, rearview mirror look of getting people through as opposed to going further upstream? I'm a big upstream kind of person.
Yeah.
And how
I
do we
don't know.
keep people from getting in the system and then being held and costing? I mean, all we hear about is new jails and prisons being built in every state we go to.
Right. So what's interesting is they were trying not to talk about two different things. They didn't want to talk about programming and such in prison. This was
Right.
really trying to focus on the decision makers of
Yeah.
parole because in me included, we are appointed individuals without oftentimes specialty,
Right.
background, whatever in this space, just like me. And so we're in making decisions that impact people's lives that for non-professional folks drives corrections people crazy. In some states, parole is kind of within corrections, and so it's kind of more of a continuum. Ours, we're supposed to be an independent board. And so what they're thinking, and rightly so, is does professionalizing the board and helping them have better training make better
Yeah.
outcomes, better decisions? I'm going to tell them the answer is yes. We all know
Right.
that anecdotally, but they don't have it in writing,
Right.
right? They don't have the evidence to show
Right.
that it's evidence-based, because what they would like to do is show that's evidence-based. Then they could change policies around professionalizing boards and then create and pay for training
Yeah.
programs that would help professionalize because they could show the evidence makes a difference.
Uh,
So they're doing things like that. That's what they're trying to do. But it is because, well, and we should talk about this, evidence-based. Let's just talk about that, right? Because they won't do it without the evidence. And so what this group is doing, which is interesting, is they're trying to build the evidence. That's what these whole
sure.
bridge of things are for. They're trying to build the evidence so that they can justify paying for it. Where you know as well as I do, a lot of places we just don't have the space with evidence. And so then lots of places then put money into things that are not based on evidence, and then they don't get a return on their investment. So this particular group is saying, look, we will help you build that evidence so that we can fund you to do these things that we're asking you to do, which that's pretty interesting.
The hard thing is how long it takes us. I'm an impatient person, and it can take decades to get to an evidence-based status in some of these. By the time we really do research, we look at that research, we validate that research, and then, retry and see that that research again, can be concluded in multiple studies. So what do we do in the meantime?
Well,
I'm working on a report right now, Renee, and I shouldn't share this with you, but I went back to some initial trainings the state did in 2005, and some of my recommendations are the same
right,
recommendations
right.
that were being done in that training then with the same provider network
Yep,
within our behavioral health system, because the things that were being trained then never stuck,
right,
never made it through. And
right.
so at the time and still today, That was the best practice. Most of that is probably evidence-based. I didn't go that deep, but we know what works and what doesn't work. And yet here we are, 20 years later, and it's the same problems.
Yeah. So we're kind of in the same what you just said, but flipped. So in the parole space, they've used the exact same stuff that might have been evidence-based for one group of people in one locale 20 years ago, but because it was cheap, easy to access and whatever, they've used those assessments across all kinds of
Yeah.
jurisdictions and called them valid, but they never were tested in any of those
Right.
jurisdictions. And so one of the big conversations at this thing was risk assessments. Now we make people in parole in corrections assess all kinds of crap, just tons, right? We always talk about this. They assess and they assess and they assess.
Yeah.
Then what do you do with the data? Well, in this group, um, their assessments are not good. They're just not good. So one of the things we're doing to help immediately for us is we got a grant with this group to build our own research tool. Now, what this group wants to do is to do the research, but it's going to take 5 years, to your point. It's 5 years just to see if it works. And
Right.
then if it works, they want to try to replicate it in other locales.
Right.
Great. But to your point, 5 years just to see if it works in my state. I mean, I'm going to benefit faster because I'm in the research process. But for anybody else, it's like, oh, this is going to be awesome.
But let's also look at the realities of state government.
Yeah,
How many board chairs and other governors and other folks are going to filter through could change the trajectory of that research over the
100%.
course of that 5 years? And
100%.
what we've seen, within health and human services and behavioral health is when there's a new director every other year, and there's a new division director every other year, and there's a new Medicaid director every other year.
Right.
It changes the trajectory of how these things are implemented. And it really changes the research because you're
It
not
does.
measuring the same thing over the course of that entire 5 years because pieces within it change whether you like it or not.
So that's part of what they're trying to bake into the causal relationship for this particular thing is like, because one of the questions within the big question of creating this is like how board members vote and
Yeah.
who votes and how they vote. And so there's a component, it's a very complicated. I mean, it's taken two different universities to put this together just for our
Yeah.
state. So it's University in Nebraska, University of Nebraska in Omaha is the main builder of the tool, but the person's doing all the causal research is out of the University of Colorado Boulder, and they were both here too. So we
Yeah.
all got brought in because they're doing current work in the space, and I think we're maybe becoming the only ones they're working in currently in this space. But it's like it took months and months to get an agreement between the groups because of
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying. Because you're trying to control variables that some of them you are not going to be able to control. And so trying to bake that in so that when you get done, the research still makes sense if some of these things change. And so you're right. And so it's very complicated research. Now they figured it out, and I don't know how they control for the variables. I'm not that far into the weeds on this one. Try not to be. But to your point, you know, it's happening because I was willing to go pursue it as the leader over here, and where previous ones have not even tried to pursue it. To your point, the next
Right.
person in might not want to pursue it, or might be mad about the concept of it, or not. They think it's not worthless and they're not going to use it at all. So you're right. That's where the evidence-based stuff. So it's really an interesting intersection because I get why the economists in the group like this with foundations want to use their money for things they know have cause that can actually make a difference. I get that, which is really smart compared to lots of foundations out there. I get it. But on the other hand, to your point, getting that research to the way they want it to prove something first is really difficult, just really
So,
hard.
so just from my perspective, let's talk about data for a minute.
Yeah.
How many parole board members are there across the United States? I mean, how many folks are
Interesting.
actually making the decisions that
Yeah.
impact what 350,000 people per year as to what happens to them when they get to be released from prison?
Yeah. So they said there's like around 400 people, which is not
Uh,
that many for the
No.
job. And so in our country, in America, some are indeterminate, oh wait, indeterminate like Iowa, meaning that they don't have a sentence that says you serve every single day. But then there's 11, 12 states that are more like the federal government that are determinate, where you get to serve every day that you have. Fun fact I learned this weekend, and they're actually researching this, is people who don't have the ability for parole lose hope. that makes
Mhm.
sense. If they have a long sentence and no opportunity for parole, they lose hope. And so we're seeing they're going to be measuring, seeing people, increase
What
suicide rates. So this is where the mental health part
where do
actually comes.
pardons come in, Renee? Or can I
Huh.
ask that question? I said,
What?
where do pardons come in? Or can I ask that question?
Well, they can, but like in our state, we have that path, but there's no grants. So for commutations, you're saying specifically.
Yes.
So like for me to commute a sentence, for them to have a shorter sentence or to be able to have an opportunity for parole, we don't grant them in our
Okay.
state. And so it's not a hopeful path. I mean, it's a path, but to know what to what end. So and other states kind of are the same way. It's not that's we've got these paths that don't go anywhere. So really the movement is parole for most places, unless you've got some of these big changing states like California has done a lot of, hey, these guys, we're not keeping them for life anymore. They're going to have, they called it, what do they call it? Second chance. There's 4 or 5
Oh,
second chance states where basically they get an opportunity at 20 years or 15, 20 something, where they're required to get a second look. Second look is what it's called.
okay.
And that fam.org group and others were working on second look. But it's 5 Democrat states because I looked total who've pulled that off. I'm like, my state's not going, they're just not gonna.
Mhm.
Because in Iowa, life means life, the whole life. Where in other states, you get life equals 15. So you'll hear people say they were sentenced to 5 life sentences. You're like, what does that mean? Well, 15 plus 15. And so it's like, but here life is life. California had somebody sentenced for 250 years. What? And so that why? But like California, if they get a denial, they can set them down for up to 15. Other states are up to 10. We have to see everybody every year. So it's so all over the place. So for you being a researcher in the middle, right, where there's only 400 people. So what they're trying to think of, and they weren't wrong, like professionalizing those 400 that are
Yeah.
like in California, they passed a law that if something bad happens at the board, somebody goes out and does something terrible, that the board can't be just fired. Because in some states the boards just disappear because people get mad about what
Oh,
happened, so they're all
right.
gone. So they look at, well, would that policy help?
Yeah.
I don't know. To your point about trying to stabilize some of this,
Yeah.
maybe, but it's such a small group. That's why they're excited about the opportunity for impact because 400 people impact 300,000 lives, right? So they're like, wow, if we could figure out how to impact these 400 people, and then we could see big return on the investment. So I get what they're thinking, but man, you have to go through all of these variables that don't match to try to find a thread that if we do this, it makes sense. And that's way above my pay grade.
I find it fascinating. This is such a narrow niche. And it's something that we don't always think about, right? Like who's going out and doing the research on this and thinking about how do we better train that small group of people that have such a big impact. But where do we go from here, right? How do we not talk about behavioral health more in some of these
Right.
conversations? Because you
So,
let us off by saying
yep.
it didn't seem like there was a thread of behavioral health woven through the conversation.
I know. The people, there were a couple groups I saw not at this party when to bring them in, right?
Mhm.
Legislators, for one, not at the party. And a lot of the changes that come in laws across your country, whether it's behavioral health or parole prison, is because legislators decided. And
Right.
oftentimes they're not educated on the system because it's a complicated system, whatever. And they make choices based on what they think is best, which doesn't necessarily translate, as we all know. We've lived it, behavioral health over and over.
Yep.
So they weren't even included in the conversation. I think that's a miss. I think that's like, you're asking people, to talk about from research and parole, like as if parole is just we can make our own choices, like we're not tethered to legislatures and whatever. And they
Right.
people in the even in the room wrongly were like, well, you're an independent body. I'm like, but are
Well,
we? I'm like, we're appointed by the governor, confirmed by the
yep.
Senate. So how independent really? And like all my admin assistance is with corrections. How independent is
Yep.
that? So it's like there's just a real misunderstanding. But back to your point about behavioral health, I was kind of disheartened by that because it is very evident anecdotally in my world for folks who don't get the treatment they need for behavioral health issues and they go out, if they start back up on meth, meth is probably the number one in our issue in our state. If they go back to that, they're very quickly back in because they don't make good decisions when their brains are not functioning correctly. But there's nobody talking about this. I mean, it's like, or even the conversation I've told you before, where they're not even having to be competent to come to a parole board. I had that conversation with a couple of these folks, and they just look at me like that's weird, but they didn't know that was true. But they're like, well,
Mhm.
why aren't they competent when they come to you? And I'm like, well, because nobody forces them to take medication. And they're like, why can't they when they're in prison? And I'm like, these are all great questions, but I don't know.
Right.
So we're getting people that are very mentally ill and in prison, they can't always take the meds that stabilize them on the outside. So Wellbutrin is one of those meds because it's very easily misused, very easily,
Yes.
and sold on the black market. So if you're on Wellbutrin outside stable, you come to prison, they can't give you that one. And there's that one and several others. And you can't have those. So they will try to get you a different cocktail that tries to help to the same, but we know that that could be not
Mhm.
beneficial and depending on your diagnosis. So you're already deep stabilized then. So you were competent to stand trial on the meds you could take outside. You come in and then there's a medication list and you can take certain ones.
Yep.
And then they may have to change them or whatever. And sometimes people just drop off those meds. So then they're not stable inside.
Yep.
But then what happens as they destabilize is the bad behaviors occur inside too, which keeps them from getting to parole longer. And sometimes people just cannot function inside in the system without
Yep.
maybe their meds or they get back into like some of the weird illegal drugs that make it into prison. And if you're a user in prison and you want to find it, you're gonna find it.
Yep.
And so they just keep using. And so then it delays
Yep.
parole. And so that's where I think it's a big miss. I was sort of disheartened by the whole thing because they want to talk about, yeah, professionalizing the board. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I'm like, the success of the people really, really depends on getting the help that they need. And so they did promise they're going to do a different bridge event specifically about programming inside to talk about these things. And then on the outside of like what types of things people go to, but they wanted us to just today talk about this. So
You know,
that's hard.
it, it's a shocker that it's really more about the system and having competent people that can manage a structured system that functions. And,
Yeah,
we never talk about systems, Renee, and how important it is to develop systems and then put competent people in the right places throughout the
right.
system.
Well, and you and I both know that not just this board, but any board, oftentimes they can be just political appointments.
Yep.
Somebody who ran for office that we really
Yep.
liked, but they didn't win the elected seat, so they just stick them there so that they
Yep.
have an appointment.
Mhm.
Parole is so serious. I just don't get how we've gotten this far doing things like that. I just don't understand. And it just impacts so many people's behavioral health. It just does. And so I don't know where this is all going to go. I'm not sure where like in the future. I mean, for myself in this space, what I'm going to do is keep showing up if they invite me and continue to talk about behavioral health because I don't know because it's the other parts you're talking about for outcomes was like staff wellness, staff, how do you not talk behavioral health if we're going to talk about trying to have outcomes
Right.
of staff wellness, right? So it's like they're there a little bit, but not all the way in. They're like, they would say buzzwords in the parole space, but they're thinking, if you don't talk behavioral health, you've missed the boat on all of these people. And so I don't know if they just think it's too hard to study. I'm not sure. So it was really fascinating to me because I can see the intersection so clearly, but we're not there. And so economists and think tanks don't want to talk about behavioral health, at least not in this space. And so, but they have an entire health care policy creation of research system. I don't know what they're doing because it's like you're trying so hard to work on these two things. How are you not trying to bridge that together, bridge to do it once? I don't know. Because anything you learn from the decision space to help with people here, right? You could use upstream. So
Right.
it's like if you could prove it that it works getting people out of prison, it definitely works to keep them out of prison, right? So it's like it's too bang for your buck. You could definitely, because to your point, we really should be talking about this way earlier. We're talking
Right.
now, this is already super expensive. We need to do something different because it's super expensive today. We should have done something way back there. So I don't think it's wrong to look at it here because I think you can then translate it, but we've got a lot of work to do. So what I'd say that you and I need to do is just continue to show up, continue to have these conversations, be in the room with these people to show them that, hey, there's other things to be thinking about. I think that's why I came because I was like, this is going to be weird. And it was as weird as I expected. And, but I'm like, but how else are they going to know if you don't come to the room and
Right.
go, hey, has anybody thought about this is really an important
Yep.
piece, right? And so they're like, I wasn't the typical person they've had in a room. I'm sure you could guess. So afterwards, they were like, there's a lot of good questions that came out of all that. Where it goes, I don't know. But I'm excited to see.
Well, I'm anxious to hear. I mean, I think this is something we're definitely going to follow up on. And, this is why we have to be in those rooms. And this is how we both end up in some pretty ridiculous places sometimes, and sometimes saying the obvious. Because if we don't show up, there may not be anybody in that room to say the obvious. And we've
Yeah.
seen that happen before. So I'm excited to see where this goes. And I'm
I
a little
was too. I
jealous.
was really
You're
honored to be
part of the
invited
think
because
tank.
what a shock to just, I mean, my background, I'm a specialist in behavioral health,
Yeah.
right? And so to land on a panel as a specialist in parole in front of a think tank to do research, I was just sitting there like, this is just wild. I'm like, 4 or 5 years ago would have never dreamed, first of all, even working in parole, but second of all, that anybody would want to know what I have to think about it. And so it's been interesting. And so it was a really great opportunity where there's a lot of space ahead. So I think you and I are in a great space because I think we can definitely, there's a gap, a wide gap of talking behavioral health and bringing it into that corrections,
Yep.
juvenile corrections conversation. And I think they've been siloed for so long that there's really not very many of us walking the path in between. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us. I think we just have to keep saying yes and showing up to weird meetings and being like, okay. And seriously, I'd sit on a panel and met the guy that I was going to talk to because he called me before. But I was like, I don't know what you're going to want me to talk about. Like, why am I here? And so he was like, oh, you're going to be great. And so he had stacked up some questions he wanted me to talk about. So I was like, oh, at least I know what we're talking about.
Yep.
But interesting. It's just really interesting. So I don't know how the room, the academia, I don't know if we're going to have people reach out to Iowa and be like, hey, can you help us with research as a result of this? I don't know. I mean, but it was the beginning of a lot. So let me tell you how the day ended, which I've never been in. The
Yeah.
day ended where they are saying, we have you here because we want to give you money to do research. Who does that? So I'm like,
Yeah.
what? So at the end of the day, they've taught us what research is. They've brought the problems and all the questions together. They did this drumming down to like 4 specific questions that you could kind of turn into quasi-research questions based on people got to vote. You got
Mhm.
sticky things to
Oh,
pick
yeah.
your top whatevers. But I'm pretty sure they also had some they were going toward anyway.
Right.
Doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, so we all got to practice and pull it down to the questions and like these are things you'd consider if you're doing this research. And then at the end, they're like, hey, we have the open RFP for research in this space on this topic.
Mm.
What? And then they're like, and we have planning grants and we have event planning and ding, 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 ding. So like now that you're here, you're being invited to ask us for money. What? And so now that's not really my space, but I was like, that's wild. So
Yeah.
I now am in a new club of
Good for
people who
you.
can ask for money to do research. And so didn't know I was in that club. And so it's just really interesting. And so there must be a screening. I made the screening. Here I
Hey, good
am.
for
So
you.
now I know. Weird, huh? All right. So the recovering politician self-care policy of the week. This was going to be new. Sometimes though you have to say yes. You just have to say yes. Somebody says, "Do you want to do such and such?" And you're like, I don't know. If you think I come from a place of if you think I can bring value, I'm happy to join your conversation. And so sometimes I don't know the value I'm going to bring. Sometimes I don't know the people. I didn't even know who was going to be here
Hmm.
until like 3 days ago. And luckily, my researcher that I've done a lot of work with was one of the people there. And so I felt a little better once I realized, okay, I've met some of these people at the conferences we've attended before. And so I knew 5 or 6 people. So I was like, okay, because I didn't even know. You have to say
Hmm.
yes. So sometimes we wait so long to find out all the details. Well, I don't know if I'm going to know who's there. I don't know if I'm going to fit in or whatever. I didn't really fit in, but I knew there was there for a purpose. And so sometimes you have to say yes and you have to take a chance. And that's how in my whole career, that's how
Hmm.
I got elected in the first place. That's how in the world I got on parole. People asked, and I was like, well, I can see it through, but I have a through line of behavioral health. And anything in my life that can make that better, I say yes. And so this is a different way to say yes. And one day we're going to make a big difference in behavioral health because I've said yes to these people. I don't know yet. I don't even think they've got that connected yet, but I'm going to help them connect the dots. And so,
Yep.
but you had to say yes to do it. I had to say, sure, I'll go to Houston. I don't know what I'm getting into. And it was fun. I've had some good food, good activities, enjoyed my time. So how about you, Jason? I know you've said yes to a lot of things, and lately for you, that's
Well,
included articles and papers and
oh,
news medias, and now
interviews,
you're in a PSA for something
interviews.
with health. I
Yeah,
mean, you
stuff
just
on
keep saying
TV.
yes.
Yeah, you really made me think about, it's hard to say yes sometimes. I think about some of those conferences where we walk up and we kick off the conference and like I don't know the tone of the conference. I don't even know if our message is the right message. We were just down in Louisiana and that one was a little anxiety provoking because we're walking into a place we don't know it very well. And we kicked off the conference. And so it was kind of hard because I'm like, what if our message is wrong? What if this isn't the right place to be? And every time we're dead spot on. But, I think that it's hard sometimes to be the
It
one
is.
that goes out there on your own, don't know anybody, and to say, hey,
Well, I
this is
personally
what I
think of
know.
your first yes of working with me when I said you want to meet me in North Dakota.
Right.
I need to do
Literally.
this. I
No,
we need to
literally,
go
I
get
said
this
yes. And I
contract.
drove to Bismarck, North Dakota, showed up in the Capitol in a suit and said, what am I doing here? Because I didn't really know what I was doing there. That's the first time I said yes to something. And I'm like, what am I doing?
And we drove
Um,
separately because you didn't really know me. You drove
right.
separate. I mean, all by yourself in a truck to North Dakota, and you're like,
Yep.
I said, I'll show you. I've done this before. And I tried to explain it to you, but you had to live it to see it. I mean, you just couldn't believe it. I know
That's
it just
that,
wasn't
that's what
real.
that's when it all started, and
Yeah.
and now we're registered to do business in Colorado, right
Right.
there.
Right. And just
So
see what, I mean, think of what that could do for the business
right,
right. And you said yes to an interesting opportunity that's like a little different than what you've been doing. So it'll be interesting. And so you get registered and who the heck knows where you're going to go with it next.
who
But you had to
knows,
say yes. And is it out of your
right?
comfort zone? Yes. Are you dealing with insurance issues? Yes. Are we dealing with logistics? Yes. And at the end of this day, you're going to be like, huh. And I bet you we can both come back to both of these things and be like, that was actually a real turning point for
Right.
these next things that we don't even know are coming.
Right. And that's what makes this fun. And that's what, 2026 is going to be fantastic because we've said yes to a bunch of things that are perfect fits. We just don't know exactly how they all fit together yet. So
Right.
it's going to be a
Yeah,
lot of fun.
exactly. So you say yes, and then you're like, then when you get there, you're like, wait a second, I do know more about this than I thought I did. And that's why you get invited. But
Yep.
at the time when they had said it and I got it, I was like, what? I don't know what I'm doing. And so even up till we got here, Brent's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm not totally sure. And so I got through it and they're like, just talk. And I'm like, you're gonna ask me what to talk about, I hope. And they're like, yeah. All right, everybody. So we talked about my trip to Houston for a think tank opportunity with Arnold Ventures and their Bridge series, where they bring ideas together to generate evidence for system changes, is what they do. So they look at hard changes, hard things to do, and try to make change. So this one was about the decision making of parole and what a weird niche it is. And there's only a few people that do this job around the country and around the world. And so if they could make impact there, how could that impact our economy? And so it was a very interesting conversation. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back with you again next time. We're going to dive into a series talking about our on the ground across Iowa. The guys traveled 3,500 miles and went to like 42 meetings last year. So we have a really in-depth view of Iowa and all the things Iowa of that system and the behavioral health system there. So we're going to dive into that and really give you kind of a first look, hands on the ground, exactly what's going on in the state. So we'll be into that next time. Until then, everybody, have a great day.